One of the keys to becoming a successful fantasy football player is staying one step ahead of the competition. Now, whether that's through a trade, a waiver wire move, it doesn't matter. It's always the same. We want to be acquiring high upside assets at the lowest cost possible. And that's why over the last 36 hours, I have combed through all of the data from week 1 of the NFL season to bring you 2 players that meet the key criteria for buying low. First, they didn't score a lot of points in week 1. They're still going to be under the radar for your league mates. Number 2, they have the underlying talent profile we know that is needed to unlock that true league winning upside. And then finally, in week 1, we saw the utilization that we know can meet that talent in the middle and provide the opportunity for them to score fantasy points that your league mates don't even know are possible. Now, with this first player, a lot of you are going to say, oh my gosh, this is a homer call, just one of your favorite players, Dwayne. And you're right, it is. James Cook, running back for the Bills, one of my favorites heading into the season, but the data led me to having him number 1 on this list today, starting with the 10 points that he scored in week 1. He's still below the radar. Let's talk about that talent profile. Yes, he was a complete and utter flop last season. Just couldn't get on the field, couldn't take away the passing downs from Devin Singletary. It wasn't a good situation. But when he was on the field, we saw those same traits that we saw from him in college. Number 1, the explosive rush rate, 13%. That's 1 percentage point above the 12% we've seen from running back ones over the last 3 years, and a 26% targets per route run. That's on the same level as Alvin Kamara, Christian McCaffrey, Austin Ekeler. So those things we saw in college, they did carry over. We just didn't see them in a big enough sample. Now, heading into the season, we weren't for sure what could we get from James Cook. We saw positive things in the preseason, but with Damian Harris there, Latavius Murray, we didn't know, would he just be a passing down back? Would it be a 3-way committee? Well, week 1 provided us with some answers to those questions, and it looks really good for James Cook. So let's use the utilization suite of tools over at fantasylife.com, and we can see in the game log view, James Cook handled 61% of the snaps for the Bills in week 1, 67% of the rushing attempts. Now, he did give way to Damian Harris when they got inside the 10-yard line, who took 2 carries, one of them for a touchdown. But overall, Cook was still on the field for 50% of the short yardage opportunities, which can often translate to carries inside the 5 later in the season. And then finally, that passing down role was out there for 50% route participation and a 24% targets per route run. That led to a 14% target share. Now, this is where we can do some really cool stuff with utilization data, because we can look at James Cook's role and we can compare it historically to running backs that were in a similar situation. And we can be conservative. For example, for rushing attempts, let's go 45 to 65%. He had 67% in week 1. Let's talk about route participation. We'll go 40 to 60%. He was at 50% in week 1. Talk about targets per route run. We can set the threshold at 22% or better. He was at 24% in week 1, 26% as a rookie. And then finally, let's assume he doesn't get the role inside the 5-yard line. Let's say Damian Harris keeps that, or if he goes down, Latavius Murray takes it over, and we can limit his rushing attempts to only 35% of what we expect from the Bills based on what we saw in week 1. So using those thresholds, let's look at the closest comps for James Cook. We start in 2022 with Aaron Jones, who scored 14.9 points per game. He finished as the RB10. Also in 2022, we had Alvin Kamara at 14.6 points per game. He was the RB12. Then we have 2013 Reggie Bush. He scored 17.7 fantasy points per game, was the RB6. 2012, CJ Spiller scored 15 fantasy points per game. He was the RB9. And then finally, we had Matt Forte in 2011. He He scored 18.7 points per game and was the running back 6. So doing the math on James Cook, it's pretty straightforward. Every player in the comp pool achieved more than what we saw from his 10 points in week 1. In fact, the lowest player for the season was Kamara at 14.6 last year, and we also have the potential upside to get a top 6 season. Now, he could be an outlier. He may not achieve those goals, but we're just playing the probabilities, and it makes him a great buy low candidate. So the second player we're going to talk about is Elijah Moore, wide receiver for the Cleveland Browns. He only scored 9.2 fantasy points in week 1. And let's start with that talent profile. As a rookie, we saw the flashes we want to see. A 24% targets per route run. And in fact, that year, over the last 7 games, he posted 6 top 36 finishes, including 3 inside the top 8. Now, I get it. Things in year 2 were not good for Moore. We have to take the good with the bad. He fell out of favor with his coaching staff. It was a complete flop. But he did gain new life in the trade to Cleveland. And this preseason, we saw some interesting things in the utilization that I really wanted to dig into for week 1. And wow, was I surprised when I got to see this data. When just honing in on those first 3 quarters, before it was a complete blowout and the Bengals started resting their starters and then Cleveland reciprocated, he had a 27% target share on an 87% route participation, and he also handled 7% of the Browns' rushing attempts. They're moving him all over the field, a la that Deebo Samuel type role that we see in San Francisco. So similar to what we did with James Cook, we can now take this information and we can look at other wide receivers that performed in a similar way as far as target earning ability goes, that were in a role, kind of like what we're seeing here with Elijah Moore. And also I limited it to players in years 3 or 4, and I excluded first-round draft picks. Elijah Moore was a second-round draft pick, so I really focused on players that went in either round 2 or 3 of the NFL draft. So let's start with the first comp, and it was Chase Claypool. We'll go ahead and get that bad one out of the way. In 2022, he scored 5.3 fantasy points per game. He was the wide receiver 81. But it gets a lot better when we get to our second name, and it's a name we've already mentioned. It's actually Deebo Samuel in 2021, who scored 21.2 fantasy points per game. That was the wide receiver 2, only behind Cooper Kupp. And then we have Deontay Johnson, also from the 2021 season, when he scored 17.3 fantasy points per game, finished as the wide receiver 8. And finally, we have none other than Fantasy Life's own Golden Showtime Tate, who finished as the wide receiver 32 in 2013 with 11.7 fantasy points per game. So we've got a pretty wide range of potential outcomes here for Elijah Moore. I don't think he's going to bust like Claypool. We've already got one nice data point. I get it. It's only 1 week, but it looked really kind of like what we saw in the preseason for Moore. And then we have the middle of the road range, or maybe he finishes as a wide receiver 3. The nice thing is there's that wide receiver 1 upside in his range of outcomes. I think the best way to think about him is potentially becoming that low-end wide receiver 2, somewhere between wide receiver 21 and wide receiver 24. We would be happy with more upside than that, but anywhere in that range, or even as a high-end wide receiver 3, we're gaining a lot of value by moving on Elijah Moore and buying low now.